Well, welcome to the HT Media Summit, Annual Summit, and I'd like to welcome Senator Mark Warner of state of Virginia as the a conversation we're going to take place between India and U.S. relationship. We're delighted and honored that you took the time, Senator. Let me just give you a little brief background on Senator. He was elected on the Senate for the first time in 2008. And in the recent election, he re-won again his third term. And he serves on the Senate Finance, Banking, and Budget and Rules Committee, and also serves on the Select Committee on Intelligence. But more important is he's the co-chair of U.S.-India Caucus, a great friend of India and understands India very, very well. Earlier, Senator Warner was the governor of state of Virginia from 2002 to 2006. It became one of the most successful tenure of any governor, where the business grew and the economic prosperity of Virginia went in a very, very positive direction. Senator, I know you have a busy schedule. You've been working a lot while the transition is going on. I just want to say thank you once again on behalf of HT Media for taking the time and having a conversation to talk about U.S. politics and U.S.-India relationship. Welcome, Senator Warner.
Mukesh, thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to participate with this conversation with you. And I know the HT Forum is a widely viewed, and look forward to our opportunity to discuss the growing strengthening of ties between India and the United States.
Thank you. Let me start. You know, we've had a transition which seems to be taking place, but we have a president who has not conceded on the election. And as we go forward, how do you see this transition taking place? Where do you see president eventually conceding, or will he keep on being obstructionist for the next 4 years?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm not sure anyone has the answer to that. I mean, we've seen the growth of authoritarian leaders all over the world. We've seen that in Turkey, we've seen it in Hungary, we see the continued rise in Russia, we see the Chinese leadership becoming more and more authoritarian. And we didn't think it would potentially take place here in the United States, but in Donald Trump, even though he was soundly defeated, a 6 million vote margin, and President-elect Biden received the same number of electoral votes, 306, as President Trump had received in 2016. So a major win. President Trump has not conceded officially. I think there's virtually no one in the White House or any of my Republican Senate colleagues who believe he's going to be able to overturn the results of the election. But many of my Republican colleagues have been unwilling to publicly speak that out. My hope is, I think they keep hoping that he will ultimately accept the results. But there is an overhang here on this election that is unlike anything that has taken place in modern American history. And my hope is, our process in the United States will have the electors of the Electoral College, I believe, vote on December 14th. But I find it very disturbing if we have to go through 2 more weeks of President Trump not being willing to willingly go through with the transition. At least, thank goodness, we have the transitions in place. The president-elect and the vice president-elect are getting the intelligence briefs that are critically important. We all know we live in a dangerous world. So I'm optimistic, but I cannot, Mukesh, I could not predict what Donald Trump is going to do, and I'm not even sure people in the White House could predict what Donald Trump is going to do or not do.
That's true. But Senator, America was always seen as the beacon on the hill, the light on democracy. And you have a president who's calling the election rigged, fraud. Does that tarnish America's image on a global standing?
I think it does. I think you hear these kind of comments that you would expect to hear out of a third world dictator who doesn't like the results of democracy. And I think that around the world there is a great interest in a return to a traditional American leadership. But it would be less than straightforward if Mr. Trump's comments don't tarnish a bit American democracy. On the other hand, let me just take a moment and say if I had to go back 60 days and looked at what we were looking at 30 days before this election, we were concerned about foreign interference. We were concerned that people might not vote because of COVID. We were concerned literally about the threat of Trump supporters showing up with firearms and trying to intimidate voters. And there was even the threat of potentially violence. And the good news is that we have seen literally the foreign interference and misinformation was kept to a bare minimum. We had a record turnout of American voters. Trump supporters or Biden supporters did not clash violently. In the aftermath of the election, our election recount system worked. The judicial system worked. In many ways, with the exception of Mr. Trump's behavior, the American electoral system should be celebrated because the system worked even with this enormous stress coming from Donald Trump. That's not the popular story out there, but it's something that I want to try to make the case if we look back objectively. Record turnout, no foreign intervention, and the recount and judicial system protected the results.
Well, which is true, Senator. I think in DC, we had all these places boarded up and we didn't see any violence. We saw statement from the Homeland Security saying one of the most secure election. So I agree with you there. So as we move forward and we listen to the announcement being made by President-elect Biden on the new team, people feel around the world that grown-ups are back in the White House. And it's a very diverse team. The question which is going to be is, while the Senate election takes place in Georgia, we don't know what the impact is going to be. Do you feel that Republicans will work with Democrats to find a common solution for America, especially on COVID, on stimulus, on the economy, and then I'll come on the international relations also?
Sure. Well, I'm hopeful, and I know we're filming this a bit earlier than its full presentation. So I've been very actively engaged, as we said off camera, with bipartisan conversations with my Republican colleagues right now about trying to provide additional economic support with COVID, with the number of states that have their budgets falling apart, with the number of people potentially losing unemployment literally the day after Christmas, with the need for additional testing and vaccine distribution. It would be stupidity on steroids if the Congress would not act before Christmas to do a bridge package till the Biden administration came in place. So I'm hopeful, and I think there are Republicans of goodwill that we're working with. I worry at times that Mr. Trump seems so disconnected from any type of his official duties in terms of focusing on COVID, even if we were to get a bipartisan package, how he will react. But I again have to remain hopeful there as well. And I do think the Biden team will be very diverse. I'm very proud of the fact that when we think about Indian-American relations, we've got the first Indian-American vice president. We're going to have in Neera Tanden, the first Indian-American head of the Office of Management and Budget, which in a sense runs all of the United States finances and programs. And since she's had a very interesting backstory in terms of growing up poor and having to take advantage of these programs in her youth, I think she'll be a great choice there. And I do think, as you said, Prakash, I think the world realizes that the people that are coming into the Biden administration have been multinational. They have believed in America's role in the world. They believe that America does best when we collaborate and cooperate with partners around the world like India. And I think it will be a great settling force, not just domestically, but I hope internationally as well.
Thank you. And coming to India, when you look at, you've been working with India, you've been to India. How do you see the Biden administration dealing with India, both on a bilateral basis and also on a multilateral basis?
Well, I do know that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi seem to have a good personal relationship. And and I'm, again, not to be entirely critical of the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration has, for example, the 2+2 negotiations, the Malabar operations between India, United States, Japan, and the invitation to Australia are all moving forward. We have seen, for example, domestic purchase and Indian purchases of defense weaponry from the United States has gone up. We've still got the challenge around the S-400 system. So I believe there will be we can build upon some of the progress that was made by the Trump administration. I also think one of the differences is that Donald Trump viewed the whole world through a America first foreign policy approach, where you partnered with America only if it benefited America's fiscal bottom line. I think there will be, under the Biden administration, something I hope to work with the administration closely with, more a notion, particularly as we think about China and some of the other questions we'll get to, a coalition of the willing. I mean, we often talk about India and the United States being the oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. We're also nations that both operate under rule of law, and that idea about how we deal with technology, how we deal with China, how we deal in the Indo-Pacific region. I think this level of collaboration will actually increase, and I think it will be less that and I hope it'll be, again, based upon shared values rather than simply a kind of a monetary decision as each country decides whether they want to side with America or with China. I think it needs to be more values-based rather than just economic-based.
And I'll come to you on China a bit later. And you talk about shared value, two democracies. And there is a concern, while President Trump and his administration didn't raise any issue on Kashmir and other areas, there's a concern that this may come up in the Biden administration. So what would be advice to government of India would be to Prime Minister Modi, how to handle this issue with the Biden administration?
Well, I've felt that the Indian government, it's not my place to be critical of the Indian government, but I do think the Indian government at times has not been as forward-leaning on making the case, not just in the United States, but on a global basis about Kashmir in particular. The fact that there had been in the prior relationship inability to do economic development, there'd been the inability of women to participate fully in society, that the Indian government's promises of opening up more job opportunities, more women participation, that story was not told in the United States. At the same time, I think the Indian government's restrictions on travel inside Kashmir seem to be overly restrictive, particularly the restrictions on foreign journalists, the restrictions on the internet. Some of that has started to ease up a little bit, but there is, we've seen some of the stories, and there is two sides of this story. I've expressed concerns privately to the Indian government on how this has played out, and I do think the Indian government's going to need to be more aggressive on making its case that some of the changes in terms of the Indian federal charter for these two regions will actually mean more advancement and more potentially long-term freedom, and not as simply a effort to silence communities that may be Muslim majority. I do find as well that and again, I have some troubles with some of the new citizenship rules that the government's put forward. So I do think the Indian government's going to need to be aggressive on making its case, not just in America, but around the world.
Which is true, and I agree with you there, Senator. China, as you see basically a sense of drifting relationship between US and China, and whereas with India, it's become much more confrontational. We have troops in Ladakh. We have Quad taking place. And so geopolitically, both countries are aligned itself. The question I have is while on a geopolitical basis, both countries are aligned, how can U.S. India partner better and deal with the rise of China in a positive way rather than in a confrontational way?
But I think that is the question of our time, not for India, for the United States, and frankly for the rest of the world. And I think back of many of my visits to India, where I think my Indian colleagues were always reluctant to not offend China. They wanted to try to, I think, play this middle course. I think the ability to play that middle course has been challenged. I think you've seen Chinese aggressive military actions, as you mentioned, and actually even armed conflict within the last couple of months. I also think you've seen China move extraordinarily aggressively in particularly technology development. I call it authoritarian capitalism, where within China, they allow ferocious domestic competition, particularly in new technology areas. I've been particularly focused on 5G, but it's 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, where they have this ferocious domestic competition inside China until a Chinese national champion emerges, the way Huawei did in 5G. That Chinese national champion then gets 75% on average of the domestic Chinese market, which translates into 20% of the global market. And so you've got already a foothold in terms of global dominance just by dominating China. And then that Chinese national champion is backed, as in the case of Huawei and 5G, with upwards of $100 billion. There is no American company or Indian standalone company alone, or Japanese company or British company alone that can take on that kind of state-sponsored authoritarian capitalism model. So I think we are going to have to, in vis-a-vis China, think about China, yes, from the military standpoint, but I think more on the technology and economic standpoint. And this is going to mean India's a great technology leader, America's a great technology leader. We need greater collaboration. We're going to need a willingness to get back engaged, both nations, in setting standards, protocols, rules. I think we've, in the democracies, and I won't say the West, but the democracies writ large, have backed off of that. And China is setting, in many areas, standards, and those standards oftentimes reflect the Chinese values of lack of transparency and the ability to have government intervention. We need to counter that. I think it can only be done by this, what I call alliance of the willing. And if we take, again, the technology fields where my background was, this may include the traditional Five Eyes partners that the United States has, along with the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. But I think it will also include Japan, South Korea, Singapore, India, Israel, potentially some nations in Europe, even outside of NATO, the Swedens and the Finlands, who have got strong suits in technology. But we're going to need this. I know there's a British proposal that's floating out there to have this kind of alliance of the willing. It's going to require, I think, much greater engagement on things like data localization and some of these technology issues between the India and the United States, so that there's a fair playing field for both countries. Because I think the real challenge here will be, how do we counter China's technology development, which is quite good? How do we counter the Belt and Road Initiative that has been, I think, pretty successful on China's basis? And how do we counter this notion that the Indian company or the American company is never going to have free access or equal access to the Chinese domestic market? And if there's always going to be a Chinese winner coming out of all the Chinese markets, that is something that is not a level playing field as we think about at least the economic and technology counter to China. I've got much more to say on this. I know I'm trying to go through very quickly, but I think this is the area where there is potentially great collaboration, but it's going to require, and I think this is one of the things, as you've already indicated, is that this doesn't have to be anti-China, but it does have to mean that a nation as great and as large, as powerful as India, has to get off the fence and realize that the authoritarian capitalism model that China is putting out, you can't be on the fence on that. You've got to decide to whether you're going to align with democracies, and clearly India is the world's largest democracy. I believe will align with that group.
That's true. And the question which comes up is and you said yes, there's a lot of opportunity of alignment between India and the U.S., especially on 5G technology, global supply chain, on healthcare. The question which I have, which the Indian viewers are asking is, while President Trump was very tough on China, very confrontational on China, where do you see the Biden presidency going forward? Will it take a tougher stand, or will it go much softer?
Well, I think Trump was directionally right with China. And I think that for a long time, under previous administrations, Democrat and Republican, Obama and Bush, and even back to Clinton, there was this conventional wisdom: the more you bring China into the WTO, international organizations, the more you bring them into the global economy, the more they're going to become a democracy. That did not prove to be the case. They, frankly, took some of the best models of British and American imperialism and turned it into their own Chinese unique model. When Trump came in, he changed that direction, but he changed it on an unequal basis. It said you had to pick between whether you're going to be in the American basket or side with the Chinese. And he didn't offer much for nations who wanted to be on the American side, because it was when you start with this America first only, if there's not an ability on supply chains, for example, for India to participate, or Vietnam to participate, or Malaysia to participate, then it becomes a straight economic proposition of who can offer you the most short-term dollars or rupees. If you don't offer something that's based on values, if you're saying it's simply American authoritarianism versus Chinese authoritarianism, that's not, I don't think, an attractive enough offer. I think this is a very important point, that I think the Biden administration, I hope, will remain vigilant and, as appropriate, tough on China. But I hope that, rather than trying to divide the world into an American, Chinese, that it can be much more a collaboration with other democracies around the world, that there will be an upside for America and an upside for countries that participate. And again, global supply chain issues are a prime example there. But it also has to, this is where we have to go back to values. As messy as both of our democracies are, I don't think India or the United States wants to give up democracy, give up transparency, give up rule of law. And if we can return to those norms, I think it will adhere to them. I think it's much easier to not just get India's support, but other nations right now that have signed on willingly to the Belt and Road, but now are starting to see with the Belt and Road initiatives that China sometimes overpromises and underdelivers. There's an opening here, but it can't be based upon an American first. So to sum up, yes, stay tough, but change the tenor and tone of the negotiations with our allies around the world.
That's great. Let me move on to terrorism. You are part of the Senate Intelligence Committee. You see all the data, and India suffers a lot from terrorism. Where do you see the scenario shifting as US pulls out of Afghanistan, and you'll see a lot of those jihadis trying to move into Kashmir, and India's reaction to that? Where do you see the terrorism moving into South Asian region?
Well, this has been an ongoing problem. As we all know, unfortunately, there are too many of these terrorist organizations, from the Haqqani to Taliban to ISIS, that still have safe havens in Pakistan. And that is an enormous challenge. And I think India, for the most part, has shown remarkable restraint when we think back to Mumbai and some of the other actions that obviously originated in Pakistan. I also worry in Afghanistan. I do believe that America needed to find a way out of Afghanistan, but this arbitrary decision to lower troop levels before Trump leaves office, leaving, frankly, in the lurch the 30 nations who fought with us in Afghanistan for up to 20 years, leaving, frankly, without protection, many of the folks who fought on the counterterrorism side that have been supported by American organizations, is extremely short-sighted, leaving, in many ways, the challenges. I know India has spent less in Afghanistan in terms of military and more in terms of trying to build up civil society. But and we always knew that doing a deal with the Taliban would be a challenge. But my fear here again is Trump is taking his short-term gains, and that potentially undermines India's efforts on civil society in Afghanistan. It undermines those NATO and the close to 30 nations who are still engaged in Afghanistan on the military side. And it clearly undermines those Afghanis who particularly have not so much the Afghan army, but some of the counterterrorism groups in Afghanistan who literally have been the point of the spear fighting against the terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. That is a huge, huge mistake, I think, made by this exiting Trump administration.
My final question to you is, India has been asking for a trade deal because there's a better chance of collaboration, better chances on H-1B. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as someone who is proud to have been one of the original sponsors on raising the country cap on H-1Bs and recognize the enormous talent pipeline that comes out of India, we still have to deal with that issue. I do think it is time for America to re-engage on trade deals. I think a 2020 version of TPP that might even include India might be something that would be worth exploring. We had spent a decade ago a lot of time thinking about intellectual property, starting with a small trade deal. I think these things all need to be back on the table, but they will take some time. It's also going to take I think at some point a greater collaboration from our Indian government friends. I think there's been, candidly, the bureaucracy on both sides on some of these trade deals vis-a-vis the United States and India, bilateral or otherwise, oftentimes moved much too slowly. So maybe, Mukesh, we can both take on that commitment to see if we can speed that up a little bit, make those discussions more relevant.
I look forward to working with you on that. And finally, Senator, what would be your advice to government in India as it prepares to deal with the incoming Biden administration? Your closing words.
I think, briefly, the Indian government needs to recommit both the United States and to the world its commitment to democracy in India itself. I think, number two, it needs to recognize that the Biden administration is going to be open to particularly advancing ties with India. I think particularly around technology development and COVID. We didn't speak much about COVID, but COVID and vaccine distribution could be an early win between US and India. I think as well, we need to work on 5G and artificial intelligence and quantum computing and a host of other new areas. And then finally, I think one of the greatest assets we have for this relationship is the Indian American diaspora. And I think you're going to see more members of that diaspora in the Biden administration than ever before historically, obviously starting with Vice President Harris. But I hope the Indian government would take even greater advantage of that Indian American diaspora to build stronger ties.
Senator, on behalf of HT Board, I just want to say thank you for your candid word, advice, and transparency. And I look forward to seeing you soon once again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.